The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as William stood before the ornate mirror in his private chambers. His reflection stared back at him, but the man he saw seemed like a stranger. Tomorrow he would be crowned King of England, yet his heart felt heavy with doubt and sorrow. William had always known this day would come, but not like this. Not without her. His sister Catherine had been the one destined for greatness, the one who understood politics, diplomacy, and the delicate art of ruling a nation. She possessed a natural charisma that drew people to her, a sharp mind that could solve complex problems, and a compassionate heart that truly cared for the people of England. Growing up in the royal household, William had watched Catherine excel in every aspect of royal training. While he struggled with public speaking, she delivered speeches that moved audiences to tears. When he fumbled through state dinners, she gracefully navigated conversations with world leaders, leaving lasting impressions. Catherine had the gift of making everyone feel heard and valued, from the humblest servant to the most powerful politician. The tragedy that took Catherine's life 6 months ago had shattered not only William's world, but the entire kingdom. A car accident on a rainy London evening had stolen away England's brightest hope. The investigation revealed that her driver had fallen asleep at the wheel after working double shifts to support his sick mother. Catherine, always insisting on using local drivers rather than the royal chauffeur, had been returning from a charity event for homeless children when fate intervened. William remembered rushing to the hospital that night, his heart pounding as he ran through the sterile corridors. The doctors had done everything possible, but Catherine's injuries were too severe. In her final moments, she had squeezed his hand and whispered, "Take care of them, William. Take care of our people." Those words haunted him every day since. The palace advisors had immediately begun preparations for William's coronation, but he felt like an imposter. How could he fill the shoes of someone so naturally gifted at leadership? Catherine had spent years building relationships with Parliament, understanding the needs of different communities, and developing innovative solutions to social problems. She had plans to modernize the monarchy, to make it more accessible and relevant to ordinary citizens. William walked to his desk where Catherine's journal lay open. He had been reading her notes about education reform, healthcare improvements, and environmental initiatives. Her handwriting, neat and purposeful, filled page after page with ideas that could have transformed England. She had vision, something William felt he lacked entirely. The weight of the crown felt unbearable before he had even worn it. William knew that the people expected Catherine to be their queen. The newspapers had written countless articles about her potential reign, and citizens had expressed their excitement about having such a progressive and intelligent monarch. Public opinion polls consistently showed that Catherine was the most beloved member of the royal family. Standing by the window overlooking the palace gardens, William watched as workers prepared for tomorrow's ceremony. Thousands of people would gather to witness his coronation, but he knew many would be thinking of Catherine. How could he address a nation that was still mourning the loss of their true queen? His private secretary knocked on the door, reminding him of the final rehearsal in 1 hour. William nodded but remained by the window. The gardens below reminded him of childhood days when he and Catherine would play hide-and-seek among the rose bushes. She had always been the brave one, always the leader in their games, always the one who came up with creative solutions when they got into trouble. The irony was not lost on him that he, the one who had always preferred books to public appearances, would now become the face of the monarchy. Catherine had thrived in the spotlight, using every public appearance as an opportunity to highlight important causes or connect with people. William, on the other hand, felt awkward and uncomfortable whenever cameras were pointed his way. As the afternoon light began to fade, William made a decision that would shock the world. He picked up his phone and called an emergency meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, and the senior palace advisors. His hands trembled as he dialed the numbers, knowing that what he was about to propose would create a constitutional crisis unlike anything England had seen in centuries. The meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock that evening, giving William just enough time to prepare his arguments. He spent the remaining hours writing notes, gathering Catherine's journals, and steeling himself for the fight of his life. He knew that tradition, law, and centuries of precedent were against him, but his conscience would not allow him to accept a crown that rightfully belonged to someone else. "William," understood that his decision would disappoint many people who had supported him and believed in his ability to rule. But he also knew that accepting the crown under these circumstances would be a betrayal of everything Catherine had stood for. She had always put the good of the people above personal ambition, and now he would do the same. As evening approached, William took one last look at his reflection. The man staring back at him now looked more familiar, more at peace with himself. Tomorrow was supposed to be his coronation day, but William had other plans. He was about to make a choice that would change the course of English history forever, all because he believed that someone else deserved the crown more than he did. The conference room in Buckingham Palace had never felt so tense. Archbishop Thomas Morrison sat rigidly in his chair, his weathered hands clasped tightly on the mahogany table. Prime Minister Elizabeth Hartwell kept checking her watch, clearly uncomfortable with the urgency of this late-night meeting. Sir Richard Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary for over 30 years, looked as though he might faint at any moment. William entered the room with Catherine's journals tucked under his arm, his decision firm despite the storm he was about to unleash. The three most powerful figures in England's government and church hierarchy looked at him expectantly, unaware that their carefully planned coronation ceremony was about to crumble. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," William began, his voice steadier than he felt. "I've called this meeting because I cannot in good conscience accept the crown tomorrow." The silence that followed was deafening. Sir Richard's face went pale. The Prime Minister's mouth fell open and the Archbishop gripped his ceremonial cross. Finally, Prime Minister Hartwell found her voice. "Your Majesty, perhaps the stress of recent events has clouded your judgment. The coronation cannot simply be cancelled. Thousands of people are traveling to London. World leaders are already here, and the entire ceremony has been planned for months." William set Catherine's journals on the table. "These contain my sister's plans for England's future, her ideas for education, healthcare, environmental protection, and social justice. She understood what this country needed in ways that I never will. The crown should have been hers." Archbishop Morrison leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Prince William, I understand your grief, but God's will has placed you in this position. We cannot change the laws of succession based on personal feelings, no matter how noble they may be." "This isn't about personal feelings," William replied, opening one of Catherine's journals. "Listen to this plan she developed for youth unemployment. She proposed partnerships between universities and local businesses, government funding for apprenticeship programs, and mentorship networks that would guarantee job placement for graduates. She had meetings scheduled with education ministers across Europe to implement similar programs." Sir Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Your Majesty, while Princess Catherine's ideas were indeed remarkable, you have your own strengths. The people need stability now, not constitutional chaos." William stood and walked to the window overlooking the illuminated palace grounds. "The people need a leader who truly understands their struggles." Catherine spent her weekends volunteering at homeless shelters, not because it was good publicity, but because she genuinely cared. She visited hospitals without cameras, helped families in crisis without announcing it to the press. That's the kind of monarch England deserves. Prime Minister Hartwell pulled out her phone, clearly calculating the political implications. "Even if we accepted your proposal, which we cannot, there is no legal mechanism for you to simply refuse the crown. You would create a constitutional crisis that could destabilize the entire government." "Then let's create a new precedent," William said, turning back to face them. Catherine often spoke about modernizing the monarchy. Maybe this is how we start, by acknowledging that the best person should lead, regardless of traditional succession rules. The Archbishop shook his head vigorously. "The Church of England has crowned monarchs according to divine right and legal succession for over 1,000 years. We cannot simply abandon centuries of tradition because of personal preferences." William opened another journal and began reading aloud. Catherine wrote, "A true leader serves the people, not the other way around. If I ever become queen, I will remember that the crown is not a prize to be won, but a responsibility to be earned every single day." She understood that leadership is about service, not birthright. Sir Richard looked desperate. "Your Majesty, even if we postpone the coronation, there is no alternative heir. You are the rightful king according to every law and tradition we have." "Then perhaps it's time to change those laws," William replied. Catherine believed that merit should matter more than birth order. "She worked twice as hard as I ever did to prepare for leadership," She studied international relations, economics, and social policy, while I was reading philosophy and literature. Prime Minister Hartwell stood up abruptly. "This conversation is becoming dangerous, Your Majesty. If word of this reaches the press, it could cause panic in the markets, political instability, and public chaos. The government cannot support any plan that threatens the stability of the realm." William sat back down and looked directly at each person in the room. "What threatens the stability of the realm is putting an unprepared man on the throne, when someone far more qualified should have been there." Catherine had relationships with world leaders, she understood economic policy, and she had the respect of Parliament. I have none of those things. The Archbishop tried a different approach. "Perhaps you underestimate yourself, Your Majesty. Leadership can be learned, advisors can provide guidance, and the institution of the monarchy is larger than any individual." Catherine didn't need to learn leadership. She was born with it, William responded. She could walk into a room full of strangers, and within minutes have them working together toward a common goal. She could see solutions to problems that no one else even noticed. That's not something you can learn from advisors. Sir Richard pulled out a thick folder filled with legal documents. "Your Majesty, I must inform you that legally you became king the moment your grandmother passed away. The coronation is merely a ceremony. You cannot refuse to be something you already are." William smiled sadly. "Then I'll abdicate immediately after the coronation. I'll wear the crown for the ceremony to satisfy tradition, then officially renounce it within the hour." The room erupted in protests from all three advisors, but William held up his hand for silence. "I've made my decision. Tomorrow's ceremony will proceed as planned, but it will be the shortest reign in English history. The crown should find its way to someone who deserves it, someone who would have made Catherine proud." As the meeting broke up in chaos, with the Prime Minister making urgent phone calls and the Archbishop praying quietly in Latin, William gathered Catherine's journals and headed back to his chambers. He had 12 hours before the coronation, 12 hours to prepare for the most important speech of his life. Tomorrow he would shock the world, but tonight he felt more at peace than he had in months. Dawn broke over London with an unusual energy in the air. Thousands of people had camped along the processional route, many holding photographs of Princess Catherine alongside traditional royal flags. The mood was bittersweet. Excitement for the historic coronation mixed with lingering grief for the beloved princess who should have been queen. William barely slept through the night, spending the early morning hours walking through the palace corridors that held so many memories of Catherine. He stopped at the portrait gallery where her official painting hung alongside generations of monarchs. Her painted eyes seemed to follow him, and he could almost hear her voice encouraging him to do what he believed was right. At 7 o'clock, the ceremonial preparation began. Master tailors helped William into the elaborate coronation robes that had been worn by kings for centuries. The crimson velvet felt heavy on his shoulders, but not as heavy as the weight of his decision. His valet, James, who had served the royal family for 40 years, noticed William's distant expression. "Nervous about the ceremony, Your Majesty?" James asked gently while adjusting the golden sash. William met his eyes in the mirror. "James, do you remember how Princess Catherine used to practice her speeches in the garden when we were children?" "Indeed, sir. She would stand on that old tree stump and deliver speeches to the roses. Even then, she had the voice of a natural leader. She would have made an extraordinary queen," William said quietly. James paused in his work. "Forgive me for speaking freely, Your Majesty, but Princess Catherine believed you would make an extraordinary king. She told me so many times. She said you had a good heart and a thoughtful mind, qualities that matter more than natural charisma." Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, the Prime Minister was in crisis mode. She had spent the night in urgent phone calls with constitutional lawyers, trying to find legal grounds to prevent what she saw as impending disaster. Her chief of staff brought her the morning newspapers, all featuring front-page coverage of the coronation, completely unaware of the chaos brewing behind palace walls. Westminster Abbey was filling with dignitaries from around the world. Kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers all gathered to witness the continuation of one of the world's oldest monarchies. Television crews had positioned cameras to capture every angle of the ceremony, expecting it to be broadcast to over 2 billion viewers worldwide. Lady Margaret Thornton, Catherine's former lady-in-waiting and closest friend, sat in the reserved section for royal family members. She clutched a small locket containing Catherine's photograph, remembering conversations they had shared about duty, service, and the future of the monarchy. Catherine had often spoken about her dreams of modernizing royal traditions while maintaining their essential dignity. Sir Richard Pemberton stood near the altar, sweating despite the cool morning air. He had backup plans for backup plans, but nothing in his extensive protocol manual covered what to do if a king decided to abdicate during his own coronation ceremony. He kept checking his watch, hoping against hope that William would change his mind. In his private chambers, William was putting the finishing touches on his speech. He had written and rewritten it throughout the night, trying to find words that would honor Catherine's memory while explaining his unprecedented decision. The speech was hidden in his ceremonial robes, ready to shock a nation. Archbishop Morrison arrived at the palace early to perform his final duties before the ceremony. He found William in the chapel, kneeling before the altar in quiet prayer. The archbishop approached softly, not wanting to disturb what might be the last peaceful moments before the storm. "Your Majesty, I've been praying all night for wisdom and guidance. I still believe you are making a grave mistake, but I want you to know that whatever happens today, the Church will support the crown." William looked up from his prayers. "Thank you, Archbishop. I know this puts you in an impossible position, but sometimes doing the right thing requires making difficult choices. May I ask what you're praying for?" "I'm asking Catherine to give me strength to honor her memory properly. And I'm asking God to help the people understand that sometimes love means making sacrifices." As the morning progressed, television commentators filled airtime by discussing the significance of the coronation and speculating about William's future reign. Royal historians compared him to previous monarchs, noting his scholarly nature and thoughtful demeanor. None of them suspected that they were about to witness one of the most shocking moments in royal history. Lady Margaret was interviewed by the BBC while waiting outside the Abbey. "Princess, Catherine would have been so proud today," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She believed deeply in her brother's ability to lead. She often said that his compassion and intelligence would make him a king for the modern age. Inside the Abbey, the Dean of Westminster made final preparations for the ancient ceremony. The coronation chair, used for over 700 years, sat ready to receive its new occupant. The crown jewels gleamed under the television lights, each piece representing centuries of tradition and continuity. William's private secretary knocked on his chamber door. "Your Majesty, it's time to leave for Westminster Abbey." William took one last look around the room where he had made his decision. On his desk lay Catherine's favorite book of poetry, open to a page she had marked with her own handwriting in the margin. "True nobility lies not in being superior to others, but in being superior to your former self." As William made his way to the golden state coach that would carry him to his coronation, he touched the speech hidden in his robes. In less than 2 hours he would stand before the Archbishop, receive the crown of England, and then deliver words that would change everything. The journey to Westminster Abbey would be his last ride as a prince, but if his plan succeeded, his reign as king would last less than an hour. The crowds lining the streets cheered enthusiastically as the procession began, waving flags and shouting words of encouragement. Many held signs reading "God Save the King" and "Long Live King William." None of them knew they were cheering for a man who had already decided that the crown belonged to someone else. Westminster Abbey buzzed with anticipation as the ancient stones witnessed the gathering of the most powerful people on earth. Kings and queens from Europe sat alongside presidents from Africa, prime ministers from Asia, and dignitaries from every continent. The organ's majestic notes filled the sacred space, adding to the solemnity of an occasion that happened perhaps once in a generation. William's Golden State coach arrived precisely on schedule, its ornate wheels crunching on the gravel outside the Abbey. Through the carriage windows, he could see thousands of faces pressed against barriers, all hoping to catch a glimpse of their new king. Children sat on their father's shoulders, elderly couples held hands while remembering previous coronations, and tourists from around the world captured the historic moment on their phones. As William stepped from the coach, a thunderous cheer erupted from the crowd. He waved automatically, his mind focused on the speech folded carefully inside his ceremonial robes. The procession into the Abbey was a blur of golden fabric, glittering jewels, and centuries-old traditions playing out exactly as they had for his predecessors. Inside the abbey, Lady Margaret felt her heart racing as she watched William walk down the aisle. Something in his expression reminded her of Catherine on the morning of her university graduation, determined, peaceful, but carrying the weight of a significant decision. Lady Margaret had known both siblings since childhood, and she recognized the look of someone about to take a leap of faith. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood at the altar in his magnificent robes, holding the crown that had rested on the heads of 39 monarchs before this moment. His hands trembled slightly, not from the weight of the crown but from the knowledge of what William planned to do. He had spent the morning in prayer, asking for divine guidance in navigating the constitutional crisis that was about to unfold. Television commentators whispered reverently into their microphones, describing every detail of the ceremony for viewers around the world. "This is a moment that connects us to over 1,000 years of British history," one veteran royal correspondent explained. "The same prayers will be spoken, the same oaths taken, as when William the Conqueror was crowned in this very abbey." Prime Minister Hartwell sat in the front row, her face composed but her mind racing through damage control scenarios. She had security personnel positioned strategically throughout the abbey, not to protect against external threats, but to manage the chaos that might erupt when William delivered his speech. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from advisors and cabinet members, all unaware of the approaching storm. The ceremony began with traditional hymns and prayers, their familiar melodies echoing off the ancient stones. William participated in each ritual, his voice clear and strong as he responded to the Archbishop's questions. To outside observers, he appeared every inch the confident king, ready to embrace his destiny and serve his people with dignity and grace. Sir Richard Pemberton watched from his position near the altar, clutching a folder containing emergency protocols that had never been tested. He had served the royal family through scandals, divorces, and political crises, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. His greatest fear was not the constitutional implications but the effect on public morale when their new king rejected the crown they had celebrated him receiving. The moment arrived for the anointing ceremony, the most sacred part of the coronation. William knelt before the Archbishop as holy oil was applied to his hands, breast, and head. The ancient ritual, unchanged for centuries, was meant to symbolize divine blessing and the monarch's sacred duty to serve God and country. As the oil touched his skin, William thought of Catherine and the conversations they had shared about the true meaning of service. Lady Margaret watched through tears as the ceremony progressed. She remembered Catherine's excitement about attending William's coronation, how she had already begun planning charitable initiatives they could launch together during his reign. Catherine had believed so deeply in her brother's potential that she had started keeping notes about how she could support his kingship while continuing her own humanitarian work. The crown was lifted high for all to see, its diamonds and sapphires catching the light streaming through the abbey's stained glass windows. A hush fell over the congregation as the most significant moment approached. Television cameras zoomed in on William's face, capturing what millions of viewers assumed was the natural nervousness of a man about to become king. "Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the people of this kingdom according to their respective laws and customs?" the Archbishop asked, his voice carrying clearly through the abbey. "I solemnly promise so to do," William replied, his words broadcast to every corner of the globe. The questions continued, each one binding him more firmly to the crown and its responsibilities. William answered each traditional question as kings had done for centuries, knowing that in minutes he would break with tradition in the most dramatic way possible. Finally, the moment arrived. The Archbishop lifted the crown above William's head, preparing to place it upon the man who would become England's newest monarch. The congregation held its collective breath, witnessing a moment that would be remembered in history books for generations to come. The crown settled onto William's head, and for a brief moment he was King William of England. Cheers erupted from the crowd outside the abbey, as news of the crowning spread through the streets of London. Church bells rang across the city, their joyful peals announcing the beginning of a new reign. But William's hand was already moving toward the speech hidden in his robes. He had promised himself that he would wear the crown long enough to satisfy tradition, then speak the words that would change everything. As the Archbishop began the final prayers of the ceremony, William prepared to deliver the most important speech of his life. The congregation began to rise for the traditional hymn of celebration. But William remained kneeling at the altar. He pulled the folded paper from his robes and looked up at the archbishop with eyes full of determination. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no turning back from the choice he had made in honor of his sister's memory. The moment William stood with the speech in his hand, an unusual quiet settled over Westminster Abbey. The congregation, expecting the final hymn and recessional, instead saw their newly crowned king approaching the ancient lectern where monarchs had addressed their subjects for centuries. Archbishop Morrison's face went pale as he realized there was no stopping what was about to happen. "My lords and ladies, distinguished guests and people of England," William began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. "I stand before you wearing the crown of our nation, but I must speak to you about someone who should have worn it instead." A ripple of confusion spread through the abbey. Television cameramen adjusted their lenses, sensing something extraordinary was unfolding. In the front row, Prime Minister Hartwell's face showed barely controlled panic as she realized all her efforts to prevent this moment had failed. 6 months ago, England lost Princess Catherine in a tragic accident that took from us not just a beloved royal, but the finest leader this nation had ever produced, William continued. Those of you who knew my sister understand that she possessed qualities that made her uniquely qualified to guide our country into the future. Lady Margaret pressed her hand to her heart, remembering Catherine's passionate speeches about social justice and her detailed plans for modernizing Britain. She had seen Catherine stay up late into the night, working on policies that could have transformed education, healthcare, and environmental protection. Now William was sharing that vision with the world. Catherine didn't just study to be a royal, she lived to serve others. While I was reading philosophy in university libraries, she was volunteering at homeless shelters and learning firsthand about the struggles facing ordinary families. While I attended formal dinners, she was meeting with community leaders and understanding the real challenges in our neighborhoods. The congregation sat in stunned silence. World leaders exchanged confused glances, uncertain whether this was part of a new royal tradition or something entirely unprecedented. Television commentators around the globe struggled to find words for what they were witnessing. William pulled out one of Catherine's journals and opened it carefully. "I hold in my hands my sister's plans for Britain's future." She had detailed strategies for reducing youth unemployment, improving mental health services, and creating sustainable energy programs that could have made our nation a leader in fighting climate change. These weren't just royal duties to her, they were personal missions. Sir Richard Pemberton looked desperately toward the exits, calculating how quickly security could clear the abbey if public reaction turned chaotic. But the crowd remained riveted, hanging on every word as William continued to paint a picture of the queen they had lost. Catherine believed that leadership should be earned through service, not inherited through birth. She spent years preparing for the responsibilities of the crown, building relationships with Parliament, studying international relations, and most importantly, connecting with people from every walk of life. She understood that a modern monarch must be a bridge between tradition and progress. In homes across Britain, families gathered around television screens watched in amazement as their new king spoke with unprecedented honesty about his own limitations. Phone calls flooded news networks as viewers tried to understand what was happening in Westminster Abbey. "I have worn this crown for 20 minutes, William said, touching the ancient circlet that rested on his head. "In that time I have felt the weight of centuries of tradition and the expectations of millions of people. But I have also felt the presence of my sister, reminding me that true leadership requires courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult." The archbishop moved closer to the lectern, ready to intervene if necessary, but William's calm demeanor and the congregation's respectful attention suggested that interruption might cause more chaos than allowing him to continue. Catherine often spoke about the need to modernize our institutions while preserving their essential purpose. She believed that the monarchy should evolve to better serve the people, not the other way around. Today I want to honor that vision by acknowledging a truth that everyone in this abbey knows, but that tradition has prevented us from speaking. Lady Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she recognized Catherine's words and ideas flowing through William's speech. This was the conversation Catherine had always wanted to have with the British people. honest, direct, and focused on service rather than ceremony. My sister possessed natural gifts that I do not have. She could walk into a room of strangers and leave with a room full of allies. She could see solutions to complex problems that escaped trained experts. She had the rare combination of intellectual brilliance and emotional intelligence that defines truly great leaders. William paused, looking out over the sea of faces in the Abbey. He could see confusion, concern, and in some cases, dawning understanding of what he was building toward. The silence was so complete that his words seemed to echo forever in the sacred space. Catherine understood that the purpose of royal privilege is to serve those who have less privilege. She never forgot that the crown is not a reward but a responsibility. She planned to use every advantage of her position to lift up others, to give voice to the voiceless, and to ensure that the monarchy remained relevant to modern Britain. Prime Minister Hartwell discreetly signaled to her security detail, preparing for whatever might come next. She had witnessed political scandals and constitutional crises, but nothing had prepared her for watching a king question his own legitimacy during his coronation ceremony. I know that many of you came here today expecting to celebrate the beginning of my reign, William continued. Instead, I ask you to join me in honoring the memory of someone who would have been a far greater monarch than I could ever hope to be. The crown should have been hers. As William reached the climax of his speech, the entire world held its breath, waiting to learn whether they were witnessing a moment of unprecedented royal honesty or the beginning of a constitutional crisis that could shake the foundations of British democracy. The silence in Westminster Abbey became so profound that the sound of William's breathing seemed amplified. Every person in that sacred space, from world leaders to television, crews to ordinary citizens who had won lottery tickets to attend, understood they were witnessing a moment that would be discussed for generations to come. Because I believe the crown should have been Catherine's, William continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. I cannot in good conscience wear it as though I deserve what was rightfully hers. Therefore, effective immediately, I am abdicating the throne of England. The words hit the congregation like a physical blow. Gasps echoed through the Abbey as people struggled to process what they had just heard. Prime Minister Hartwell shot to her feet, then sat back down, realizing there was no protocol for this situation. The Archbishop's face had gone completely white, and he gripped his ceremonial staff as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. William carefully removed the crown from his head, holding it reverently in both hands. This crown represents over 1,000 years of British history. It deserves to rest upon the head of someone who truly understands its weight and meaning. Since Catherine cannot wear it, I choose to ensure it goes to someone who shares her vision and values. Television networks around the world scrambled to understand what was happening. Royal correspondents who had covered decades of ceremonies found themselves without words to describe the unprecedented scene unfolding before their cameras. Social media exploded with confusion, shock, and debates about the legal implications of a king abdicating during his own coronation. Lady Margaret felt as though Catherine's spirit filled the Abbey. This was exactly the kind of bold, principled stand Catherine would have taken if their positions had been reversed. She could almost hear Catherine's voice encouraging William to follow his conscience, regardless of the chaos it might create. I know this decision will cause confusion and concern, William said, addressing the congregation's obvious distress. But I believe Catherine would be proud that I chose integrity over convenience, truth over tradition. She always said that real leadership requires making difficult choices for the right reasons. Sir Richard Pemberton was frantically scribbling notes, trying to remember if there were any legal precedents for this situation. Edward VIII had abdicated in 1936, but he had been king for almost a year before making that decision. No monarch in British history had ever abdicated during their coronation ceremony. The implications began hitting various officials simultaneously. Who would be the next in line for succession? How would Parliament react? What would happen to the Commonwealth nations who recognized the British monarch as their head of state? The constitutional lawyers would be working overtime for months to sort through the legal maze William had just created. I want to be clear about my intentions, William continued, seeming to anticipate the questions racing through everyone's minds. I am not abandoning my duties to Britain or attempting to destroy our constitutional monarchy. Instead, I am proposing that we find a way to ensure the crown goes to someone who truly embodies the qualities Catherine possessed. The Archbishop finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper that his microphone barely picked up. "Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. The legal ramifications alone could take years to resolve." William nodded respectfully toward the Archbishop. "I understand the complexity of what I'm proposing, but sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting complexity and uncertainty. Catherine taught me that avoiding difficult decisions is not the same as making wise ones." In the front row, foreign dignitaries were having whispered conversations with their translators, trying to understand not just William's words but their implications for international relations. The King of Spain looked particularly concerned, as did the President of France, both of whom had developed strong relationships with Catherine during her years preparing for royal duties. "I have spent months reading Catherine's journals and notes about her plans for Britain's future," William said, holding up the leather-bound books that had become his most treasured possessions. "She had specific ideas about educational reform, healthcare innovation, environmental protection, and social justice that could have transformed our nation. Those ideas shouldn't die with her." The crowd outside Westminster Abbey had grown restless, sensing that something unusual was happening inside. Without audio from the ceremony, they relied on the expressions of people near windows and the increasingly frantic behavior of news crews. Rumors began spreading through the crowd that something had gone wrong with the coronation. Catherine believed that the monarchy should serve as a symbol of Britain's best values: compassion, justice, service to others, and commitment to progress while respecting tradition. She wanted to use the platform of the crown to address the real challenges facing ordinary families: housing costs, job security, educational opportunities, and healthcare access. William's words resonated with many in the congregation who had worked with Catherine on various charitable initiatives. They had seen her genuine commitment to improving people's lives, her willingness to roll up her sleeves and work alongside volunteers, and her ability to inspire others to join causes they might never have considered supporting. "I know that my decision today will create uncertainty and difficulty for many people who have worked hard to prepare for this moment," William acknowledged, looking directly at the various officials whose carefully laid plans he was dismantling. "But uncertainty in service of a greater good is preferable to certainty built on a foundation of compromise." Lady Margaret stood up slowly, her movement creating a ripple of attention through the abbey. With tears streaming down her face, she began to applaud. Her clapping started as a solitary sound in the vast space, but gradually, others joined her. First a few members of Catherine's former charitable organizations, then some of the younger royals, and eventually dozens of people throughout the congregation. As the applause grew, William felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since Catherine's death. He was keeping his promise to honor her memory, even if it meant sacrificing his own future as king. The crown in his hands seemed lighter now, ready to find its way to someone who would wear it with the wisdom and compassion Catherine would have brought to the throne. The applause that began with Lady Margaret spread through Westminster Abbey like ripples across a pond, but it was not the celebration typical of royal ceremonies. This was something deeper, recognition of a profound moment of moral courage that transcended politics and tradition. Even those who disagreed with William's decision found themselves moved by his obvious sincerity and love for his sister. As the clapping gradually faded, William placed the crown carefully on the altar, where it had waited for centuries between coronations. The gesture was simple but symbolic. He was returning the crown to the nation rather than keeping it for himself. The Archbishop stepped forward, unsure whether to retrieve the crown or wait for further instructions from a man who was no longer technically king. "Before I conclude," William said, his voice now carrying the weight of finality, "I want to share Catherine's vision for what the monarchy could become. She believed that royal power should be used to amplify the voices of those who struggle to be heard. She dreamed of a crown that stood not above the people but among them, working alongside everyone who seeks to build a better Britain." Prime Minister Hartwell realized she needed to act quickly to maintain some semblance of governmental stability. She discreetly sent messages to her cabinet members, calling for an emergency session of Parliament within hours. The constitutional crisis William had created would require immediate legal attention, but she also recognized that his words were resonating with many British citizens who had loved Catherine. Sir Richard Pemberton watched in fascination and horror as centuries of carefully maintained protocol crumbled before his eyes. Yet even he had to admit that William's speech captured something authentic about Catherine's character that no amount of official royal communications had ever achieved. The princess had indeed possessed extraordinary gifts that could have transformed the monarchy. "I know that many of you are wondering what happens next," William continued, addressing the practical concerns that were undoubtedly racing through everyone's minds. "The truth is, I don't know. Constitutional lawyers and Parliament will need to determine the legal path forward. But I do know that whatever happens, it should honor Catherine's belief that leadership requires courage, to choose principle over convenience." Television. Viewers around the world watched in amazement as William concluded the most unprecedented royal speech in modern history. News anchors struggled to provide commentary for something that had no historical precedent. Social media platforms crashed temporarily as millions of people tried to share and discuss what they had witnessed. The Archbishop, finding his ceremonial voice, spoke words that would be quoted in history books. "Your Majesty, or perhaps I should say, Your Royal Highness, your decision today demonstrates a nobility of spirit that transcends titles and crowns. May God guide our nation through the uncertainty you have created in service of your conscience." William bowed respectfully to the Archbishop, then turned to address the congregation one final time. "I ask for your understanding and support as Britain works through the challenges my decision has created. I also ask that you remember Catherine not just as a princess who died too young, but as a leader whose ideas and values can still guide us toward a better future." Lady Margaret stood again, this time not to applaud but to speak. Her voice carried clearly through the Abbey's acoustics. "Princess Catherine would be proud of your courage today, William. She always said that true nobility lies in doing what is right, even when it is difficult." As William walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, no longer wearing the crown but carrying Catherine's journals, he passed faces showing every possible emotion: confusion, admiration, concern, and respect. The ceremonial procession that should have celebrated his coronation instead became a somber march toward an uncertain future. Outside the Abbey, the crowd sensed that something extraordinary had occurred. When William emerged without the crown, a murmur of confusion rippled through the thousands of gathered spectators. But when he raised Catherine's journals above his head, many understood that he had chosen to honor his sister's memory in the most dramatic way possible. In the days that followed, Britain would face its most significant constitutional crisis in decades. Parliament would debate new succession laws, legal scholars would analyze precedents, and the media would dissect every word of William's speech. But on that morning in Westminster Abbey, none of those complications mattered. What mattered was that a man had chosen love over ambition, principle over power, and truth over tradition. William had refused a crown because he believed someone else deserved it more, someone who could no longer claim it, but whose memory inspired him to make the most difficult decision of his life as the Golden State Coach carried William away from Westminster Abbey for the last time as a member of the direct royal succession. He felt Catherine's presence beside him. He had kept his promise to honor her memory, even at the cost of his own destiny. The crown would find its way to someone else, someone who might possess even a fraction of Catherine's wisdom and compassion. Years later, when historians studied this moment, they would debate whether William's decision strengthened or weakened the British monarchy. But those who knew Catherine understood that her brother had done exactly what she would have wanted. He had chosen service over self, and in doing so, had demonstrated the very qualities that would have made her an extraordinary queen. The crown waited on the altar of Westminster Abbey, ready for whoever would next prove worthy to wear it. But William walked away knowing he had honored the memory of someone who would have worn it better than anyone, and that knowledge brought him the peace that had eluded him since the day Catherine died.